All right, we're going to talk about engineering and global practices today. Um, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, they're going to be examples from international events, international relationships. Everything I'm saying applies to how you should just kind of behave anyway, though. Even though it's one country, the US is one big country, you'll frequently find big differences between how the Northeast does things versus how California does things, how Texas and Florida do things. You need to be prepared to deal with that. Yes, there's some benefits of trying to stay national, but you're going to start finding that it's increasingly rare to exclusively work with people from one country. As projects get more complex, as supply chains become more international, you're going to have to learn to deal with changing laws, new standards that you're being held to because one of your members is in India versus being in China. And you're also going to have to remember things like, how do I do this in a sustainable manner? How do I make sure what I'm doing doesn't make climate change worse? And depending on what you want to do, depending on where you're working, that actually looks really different whether you're working in China, India, Australia, Africa, Europe, the United States, Latin America. It matters, but it's going to be very different how it looks at the end of the day. And this applies to everybody in the room. This is not an exclusive IEP message. I have worked internationally, both through the IEP program, but also through just general work. My wife has been sent to, she also did the IEP program, but she's also been sent all over the place for various jobs, for certain trainings. And I have a lot of friends who didn't do the IEP, who have to regularly fly all over the world because part of their team is either in Europe or Africa or Australia or India, and they just have to get used to it. If you plan on being any kind of sales or application engineer, this is a thing you're going to have to get used to. Engineers, in the fulfillment of their professional duties, shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in objective and truthful manners, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. All right. So literally the objectives are to understand the importance of ethics and global engineering, learn about cultural considerations and engineering ethics, and recognize the challenges and benefits of global engineering. Like I said on the first slide, a lot of what I'm going to say today is stuff you should just be doing. You should already be doing this. I can't cover every scenario you're going to run into. I can't. Even if I had all semester, I can't do it. So I have to teach you the tools on how to figure it out. Yes, I'd love to tell you all the things culturally you need to prepare for. I can't. I can only use main examples that I'm familiar with and tell you how you need to prep for the next time you meet somebody. So like I said, our supply chains are becoming more and more complicated, more and more intricate. It's very common for raw material to be exported from one country, go through refining in a second country, go through processing and shaping in a third country, and then made into a final product in the fourth country. This is very common. In my experience, when I worked for the Navy, when I was a full-time Navy civilian, I was tasked with making sure all the things we made were all sourced from things made in the USA. This added a 50 to 100% tax on everything. Everything in the US was always more expensive. And it was frustrating because under normal circumstances, under normal dynamic competitive environments, you go to the cheapest possible product that provides you the minimum performance requirements. By adding the requirement needs to be made in the US, that price could double or triple really easily. And so things really aren't made in the US anymore. A lot of the craftsmanship that was once synonymous with American quality has been outsourced. So if you want to make anything, you really need to be prepared to go across the world to do it. Apple ran into an actual situation where they did the economic analysis of manufacturing their iPods and iPads in the US versus in China. It's $1,000 a phone right now. It would be $10,000 a phone if it was made in the US. In addition to that, a lot of the skills required just to make the factory no longer exist in the US. They would have had to outsource the tool engineers to China because that's the only place where you can find them nowadays. So we're going to quickly define, what does global engineering mean? So I pulled all of this from the book you're supposed to be using. I don't require you to buy the book because it's not really useful to you after you've graduated. So it's the application of engineering principles that takes into account global, cultural, social, and economic context. It involves designing solutions and systems that are universal, so it needs to be applicable, sustainable, culturally sensitive. The technology and communication tools allow engineering projects to expand beyond local borders. It's atypical to have all U.S. citizens on a project. Engineers collaborate in real time across continents, ensuring that the best minds work together to solve complex problems. So remember, you are going to be working in a dynamic, competitive environment. If the best person for the job is in Japan, and you want to make sure you're paying for and getting the best person for the job, you're going to have to go get them. And nowadays, that's really not hard. There are companies that are utilizing CAD software 24/7. Literally, a project will start in Germany. They'll end their day. The data will be sent to the US. They will start their day using the same files, updating it, and then they will end their day sending it to Japan, and the cycle will start over. This actually happens. So you need to be prepared to have to talk to people from all over the world regularly. So you need to expect to be part of large teams, especially if you work for a corporation. There's a joke nowadays about there being systems of systems and teams of teams. But the thing is, those teams function as experts. And they give you good recommendations, and they are worth the cost, but that means you're dealing with many different personality types. And you can't just choose to not to work with some people. First of all, you're all freshman engineers in my eyes. Even after you graduate, until you've got 5 to 10 years of experience, you're a freshman engineer. And you're not going to have the option to choose who you work with. You're going to take the job that's given to you. And so you need to be prepared to not be on the team you want to be on. And so you're going to have teams that are, if we do an example of desalination, there will be one team that understands the physics and chemistry really well. There's going to be another team that understands the logistics of installing it where you want to install it. There's going to be another team that will do the project economics. And there will be teams that are focused on construction. There will be teams focused on labor. So navigating these markets is very complex all by themselves. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a pretty good grasp of desalination, but I promise you, it's not easy. So navigating international markets and having to navigate more than 2 of those at once is incredibly hard. And so you're going to have high frustration levels on all parties. So you can't, so for the case of the economics of things, it's not just about what's the base cost and what's the base profitability. It's what are the shipping expenses going to be? Are there any tariffs we have to worry about? When we design this thing, are there going to be special regulations we have to work with? Even if the material we want, it can be found in that country, can we buy enough of that material? And these questions vary widely between the US, Asia, Middle East, Europe, Africa, Latin America. So it's not just enough to be a technical expert. Being the best at something doesn't mean anything if you can't work with other people. You need to be culturally intelligent. So, for example, the Germans have a very direct form of communication. When they're talking, they will say what they're trying to say in as few possible words as they can think of. And this is normal behavior for them. But Germans have a lot of trouble working with other cultures. Because even though they learn to speak English, they learn to speak French, Spanish, Chinese, whatever, because they're so direct, nobody wants to deal with them. They're perceived as abrasive. Now, I want you to think about another example. How do people in New England come across to the rest of the country? The Northeast, from New York to Boston, were frequently described as mean. Whereas people from, say, California or Georgia are described as being very friendly. Same thing applies. So when you're coming from the Northeast, all of you are in the Northeast, when you go interview, if you're interviewing somewhere down south, be prepared to chit-chat before you answer the question. In some extreme cases, German companies will hire American companies to do all of the communication for them because of how abrasive the Germans come across. Additionally, this abrasion regularly burns bridges to the point that some Indian companies won't do business with some German companies. So you need to be adaptable, culturally aware, and ready to tackle logistics challenges that get thrown at you. There's a really good chance that you will be simultaneously talking to Germans, who are incredibly direct, in the morning, and talking to Asians in the afternoon, who are very indirect. And you can't communicate the same way to the two of them. You literally have to send them separate messages. Because if you send the very, very direct message to everybody, yeah, the Germans are going to appreciate that. That's great. But if you send the direct message to people who want the indirect message, they're going to be offended. And vice versa, if you send the very long message to everybody, the Germans are going to receive it and say, I would rather have had that in 2 sentences. And actually send you a message saying you talk too much. All right, so we're going to do an actual example. This actually happened, and this ties back to an example I had about whether a company was being altruistic or not. Now, in this scenario, the company was tasked with implementing a desalination system. And what they designed was going to work, and what they started installing, for the most part, did work. And it met all of the community's requirements. However, the community didn't want to use it. Now, there was this practice that the community had where around the same time every day, all of the families would gather around this one spot, fill up their water jugs, talk to each other, and then go home and make dinner. And so they didn't really want to get rid of that cultural event. However, the company that designed the desalination system had every intention of installing plumbing in the community. And this wouldn't have been terribly expensive. In long term, it would have been cheaper for the community, but that's not how the community viewed it. The community viewed it as this company from somewhere else coming in, telling them that their cultural practice they needed to get rid of it, and also they needed to pay all of this money to install this plumbing system to drink the water, that all they wanted was the water to go to this one location in the center of town. Now the thing is, that company did meet all of the requirements. But what they didn't do is spend any time with the company before they got there. And when you do business internationally, if you can't find a partner, you send people there. And you have them live there for a period of time, long enough for them to understand and start adopting a lot of the culture. And so had that happened in this case, where engineers had been sent and they had started living and they brought their families and they learned what the community actually wanted, they would have known, oh, we can't get rid of this event. We should just pump all the water to this one location and make it so that if they wanted plumbing later, they can install that later. However, they didn't do that. So now the community not only views the external company as being culturally insensitive, because they viewed what the company was doing as saying, your culture's dumb, you shouldn't be meeting at the middle of the day, but also tried to stick them with this very large bill for something they didn't really want. And so the next time that company wanted to do business near that location, they had to deal with all these rumors that simply weren't true. And it was all based off of a simple misunderstanding. All right, so let me take you back to when I first got out of college. When I graduated from URI, I started working as a petroleum engineer down in Georgia. And this company had business ties in Europe, Germany, Austria. They had business ties in Turkey. They had business ties in Africa. They had business ties in the Middle East, Asia, Australia, India, Japan, China, Latin America, all over the place, right? And so I was the youngest guy on the team. I didn't have a family. So their thought process was, you can be the liaison. And I thought this was a great deal because the first person I was functioning as the liaison for was this German guy, Thilo von der Grün. Thilo was around my age. He was a very smart petroleum engineer. He was very competent at what he was doing, but even though he spoke fluent English, he didn't fully understand customs of the people of Georgia. His directness came across as harsh. And a lot of times he didn't mean anything by it, but that didn't matter. In the context of talking to people in the South, they talk very slowly about everything. And when they do talk, they don't talk directly about the thing that they want to address. They talk around it. And he hated that. And so he actually described it like talking to Ents from Lord of the Rings. But the Georgians didn't appreciate how direct he was. They thought he was impolite, and he thought that they were intentionally being rude by talking so slowly. And so a lot of times I'd have to run interference. I'd have to get in between the two of them. So if we went to the bar, I would have to talk to the people at the bar, the people around us, like, this guy's German, he doesn't know any better, he's going to be really direct, this is how you need to talk to him, and vice versa. It would get to the point where he would just hand me his wallet whenever we go out and be like, you need to pay for me because I don't understand how tips work. And he did mean well. It's just he was getting overwhelmed with the cultural differences. Now, in that scenario, my company had the luxury of having me, having somebody who could do that, somebody who could run interference. However, some companies don't have that luxury, number one, and some companies don't realize they need it until it's too late. So in my role, as running intermediary for the German clients, my company also did the same thing. Now, we were all engineers, and so we would take a lot of engineering projects, but we would also be the liaisons for our German counterparts. So our client had been making strides in India. They'd made a bunch of successful investments, and so they saw if they installed a particular type of processing station in India, that they'd make a ton of money. And so they wanted to do that, but India, also big place compared to the like the U.S. is. You couldn't just apply the rules that you learned on one coastline and apply it to the next. You actually had to be prepared. These two cities operate very differently from each other. So in this case, well, not us, our German parent company, they went and they were discussing logistics and plans and what they wanted to install, and the design was good, it was going to work. They just needed to get the right laborers and construction teams and all that jazz down there. However, in India, it's common for there to be a very rigid hierarchy within companies, in the sense that the German parent company was dealing with one construction company and one Indian engineering company. And they were owned by two different families, but really it was the same family. It was two companies, two granddads who founded the individual companies, but because that the grandparents were the same people, or the same family rather, they always worked together. And so what ended up happening is the German company, since they were working with us and we were engineers and they already had a functioning design, what they wanted to say was, we have enough engineers. That's what they meant to say. What they said was, we have enough, or we don't need any more Indian engineers. Now, part of the discussion that they didn't fully appreciate, the Germans, is there were a ton of Indian engineers on our team living in the US, but that's not how those two firms took the statement. The way they took the statement was, we don't trust Indians. We don't think they're smart enough to do this. They're incapable, da-da-da-da-da. We just need them to do the scut labor work. And though that isn't what they meant to say, that is how that was interpreted. And so this came across as particularly rude and mean, and that ended the ties between the two companies. And the two Indian companies then proceeded to tell the locals, hey, this is what happened in the meeting we had with these Germans. And, you know, rumor mills exist. I'm sure we've all dealt with them. So what ended up happening is all of the companies in that general area refused to work with this German company because of the statements made by one engineer of, we have enough people doing that job. And how he should have handled it is talk to them about it for probably an hour, just saying, well, who do you want on the team and who's good for this task, and maybe we can shuffle people around. Like, he didn't need to make any promises, but at least hear them out. But he didn't. He said no. And so the fallout was severe. The deal fell through, and after that, the American company, even though they weren't the technical experts, because they understood the design enough and because they understood the culture enough, they were the ones that ended up having to drive all of the efforts moving forward. All right, so I know I just said it in the last slide, but in this slide, we're going to go into it more deeply. You can't just speak the language fluently. It's not good enough. You need to understand the culture as well. So one example is if you want to do business in Japan, you're much better off sending someone from your firm to live in Japan and consult with another firm for a few months so they can get caught up on the culture. While this is going on, you really should be hiring a native Japanese speaker who also speaks English and teaching them about your business. A lot of times, what companies will do is they'll exchange employees to do this so they can have a collaboration. But if you can't make that, you have to send somebody to the country you plan on working in, and you need to hire somebody from that country to work for you. And these people need to be your translators. So the person who speaks Japanese that you're teaching about the business, when they actually go to the meeting, they do the actual translating. They don't have to go to you directly every time there's a question. It needs to come across like they actually understand what's going on and are more than just a translator. They also need to know the business model. They need to know the technical jargon. They need to know the project goals. They need to genuinely be part of your team. They cannot just be the translator. It is not good enough. And when you go to negotiate, these two people, the person you sent there to learn Japanese and learn Japanese culture, needs to sit next to the guy who learned about the company. When it comes time to negotiate, take the translator's advice. If the translator tells you to put the oldest person at the head of the table and pretend he's making all the decisions, do that. This sounds silly, but from a cultural, social standpoint, this is actually expected in Japan. So even though I might own a company, it might be economically advantageous for me to pay my dad to come along, pretend he knows what he's talking about, put him at the head of the table, and have him pretend to make the decisions, even though I'm really the one doing all of it. All right, knowing the standards for one country is not good enough. You have to know them all, or you have to know somebody who does. Now, a lot of people would assume that Europeans have much higher regulations for certain industries, or for most industries. And for the most part, you would be right. However, there are exceptions. So the first, and I talked about this, about not starting new regulations and being trusted before, where U.S. natural gas, they started just building pipelines before they knew how pipelines worked. And that's how ASME came into existence. And so they were willing to experiment and try and take risks. But because they were so slow with reviewing the science and making laws based around the science, there were a ton of new rules drafted effectively every day and every week until the deaths and explosions stopped. And so it wasn't until ASME came along and defined what was safe and what wasn't that natural gas became safe. Well, the Europeans, their approach was, you can't do anything until it's safe. Which might not be a terrible way to do things. And so what ended up happening is, once the US figured out the safe way to handle propane and natural gas, instead of following all of the rules that the Americans had, they just went through the physics and said, all right, these are the rules you have to follow. And so it's actually, in a handful of instances, easier to build pipelines in Europe than it is to do it in the US. Now, one of the big differing standards is, and this applies to most oil wells, this also applies to liquefied natural gas. In the US, any station you build, whether it's a pumping station, or if it's a well, or if it's a refinery, you have to take the volumetric flow rate of every pump and assume that that pump is just spraying into the air. And you have to assume it's going to do that for 30 minutes. And then you have to calculate volumetrically how much crap you just dumped on the ground. And the well, the pumping station, the refinery needs to be built on top of a bowl-like structure that can hold 1.5 times that volume. So big pumping stations end up having these massive foundations. And the reason for this was, well, 100 years ago, it might take the safety system 30 minutes to shut off. And that's how irresponsible a lot of design firms were. So the law came along and said, well, this is a punitive measure, since you're not being faithful to what you're supposed to be doing. In Europe, there is no bowl requirement. Or there is, but it's a lot lighter. So in Europe, you take all of the control systems and you say, how long does it take this control system to shut off? And you take the worst case scenario and figure out what the volumetric flow rate is for what amount of time based off of what the control system can do, and you build that bowl. And the thing is, they intentionally design it in such a way that even if something goes wrong, that volume's tiny. Can't do that in the US. It's a subtle difference, but it's a telling difference. All right, so I want you to remember, you are most likely going to have to do some international work. You're going to have to work with people who have very different opinions from you and behaviors from you, and you're still going to need to work with them. You being the best engineer or them being the best engineer is not enough. You have to do the legwork to be able to work with them and communicate with them, even if they're unwilling to change. All right, so we're going to do a case. And while we're doing the case, I want you to think about how will you balance the economic benefits with the responsibility to uphold the company's values and maintain its reputation in the global market. All right? So again, you're in a competitive arena. Your role at a large multinational company comes with a complex set of challenges. So you work for a large multinational corporation. For economic reasons, you've been forced to produce this product overseas. The manufacturing process is very labor intensive, so the product requires cheap labor. Manufacturing overseas allows you to avoid U.S. laws and regulations, tariffs in that country, and transport costs. Foreign governments have also, or specifically this country's government, has subsidized internal investments for you, giving you cheap money to build. This is a relatively common event. If your end consumer is not in the US but is somewhere else, it's very common to just manufacture in that country to avoid tariffs. All right, so we have to do some science talk. So we are making a product. The process is called production on demand. So this product will degrade very quickly. It has a shelf life in its container. Keeping it cool doesn't help. So you're going to make 7, product's name, by mixing MIC, which is methyl isocyanate, with 1 naphthol to make carbaryl. Carbaryl is difficult to store. However, its ingredients are not. So you only manufacture carbaryl when you need it. Before I go any further, does anybody know what that W means? That W means it reacts with water. So I want you to think about lithium-ion batteries. So if you were to take a lithium-ion battery and dump it in water, it would light on fire. You spraying it with water only makes it burn hotter. Your company's running into some IP issues. So the fact that the manufacturing process is simple, it's just the mixture of those 2 chemicals, is kind of the cornerstone of your company's innovation. Yet there's some other tidbits that I'm not going to get into just because it would take too long to explain. But the country you're working in doesn't really respect patents, or at least not patented processes. And so once the process is revealed to that community, they're just going to start sharing that with everybody else. So to mitigate the risk of IP theft, we only use the colloquial names for the chemicals, so MIC, alpha N, and 7, instead of the actual formula names. This obscures the specifics of our proprietary process. All right. Local regulations do not specify special storage protocol for MIC. By contrast, U.S. law mandates stringent storage measurements. MIC must be housed in a sealed steel tank. The steel tank should be enclosed within a concrete containment unit. The containment unit's capacity must be at least 1.5 times that of the steel tank, ensuring containment of any potential spills. Your company has persistent high turnover rates. Compensation structure has been unchanged for 3 decades. That is to say, the amount that the new hire is paid today is the same exact amount that the new hire was paid 30 years ago. The factory management has seen no change in leadership for 30 years. So, as an aside, if you start working somewhere, one of the things you should say at your interview is, what are the common promotional paths here? And if they don't give you a good answer, don't plan to stay for very long. If you are working somewhere and it becomes clear that for you to get a promotion, the person ahead of you needs to leave, and they're not going to get a promotion for whatever reason, that means you're never getting a promotion. So if it's been the same manager for 30 years and they have no intention of leaving, you're not going to become manager ever. So there's a clear lack of opportunity growth here. Because of this, there's the high turnover rate. Now, the company isn't picking up on this, but when this high turnover rate occurs at the lower levels, that's usually tied back to bad management. And you don't want high turnover rates, because when that happens, you also have to retrain. It costs money to train. Most places will do a training like once a year just to keep you up to date, but it takes about 3 months to 6 months to make you a profitable employee. And so if they have to keep doing that, there's an inherent cost of replacing you. In this particular facility, because of the high turnover rate, it's almost impossible to train everybody. All right. Since you're going to be watching this at home, I want you to write something. I want you to go back to each of those slides and think about, would you want to work there? Would you even want to visit that facility? Would you recommend a family or friend to work there? If you were part of the management's design team, would you recommend any changes? And can you observe any obvious ethical challenges? All right, so we're going to talk about the actual event. So Union Carbide made carbaryl. This was a type of pesticide. It was made by mixing methyl isocyanate, MIC, and 1-naphthol to make carbaryl. So the empirical formulas are written there. The 3-dimensional images are below. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is the storage tank. This is the actual storage tank from the story. It is the same image from the previous slide. You can kind of see on the edge where there's been damage. One of those is where the fire diamond was supposed to have been. On this particular day, the fire diamond had rusted off to the point that it was impossible to read. Management directed the newer employees to clean the tank. This is standard scut you'd expect to do. So, cleaning the tank, what does that mean? So, they went to the tank with a bunch of hoses, a bunch of brushes, and they started rubbing off all of the rust. Now, for normal tanks like that, you need to repaint it every year. They repaint the Newport Bridge for the same reason, for corrosion control. That's not what happened with this tank. They just let it sit, so it just slowly disintegrated over time. They started spraying the tank with water. Well, because of the corrosion, a small leak formed. And had they been trained correctly, they would have known to walk away. But that's not what they did. What they did is they started spraying it with water. Now, they didn't start spraying it with water. They didn't see a leak and go, oh, we should spray this with water. It was that leak was lighting on fire because it was hitting wet parts of the tank. And they didn't know where the fire was coming from, so they just sprayed it with the hose, which just made the fire bigger. Then, the heat from the fire caused the rest of the tank to slowly disintegrate, or quickly disintegrate in this case. And it caused all of the mick to come out. And naturally, the employees who have not been trained on what this chemical is start spraying it with water because it's on fire. And this just got worse. Now, they eventually stopped the fire, but by the time they did that, enough of the mick had evaporated into the air because of all of the heat that it started to spread. When it comes to safety, you really need to be clear about what's going on. And this was a gross level of incompetence by the managers. At the very least, it should have been clear that that mick material shouldn't get wet. So, since it evaporated, now it's all in the air. So, that is the location of the factory owned by Union Carbide. Now, the facility should have had special suppression units. If you are working at a manufacturing facility that processes lithium, one of the big requirements is how do you put that fire out? And I'm sure we've all seen the videos of the battery bank being dumped in oil. It's because the oil doesn't react with lithium. Something similar needed to be used here. In certain places, they use xenon. There was a preparedness lab. None of the employees were trained on what to do when there was a fire. So they were just running on instinct when it occurred. There was no training at all. The employees, like I said, there was a training gap. And so the manager was just filling bodies by hiring them without telling them anything that they needed to know. And he used the line that he was trying to protect IP as justification, but the reality was he was just being cheap. He didn't want to pay for training. He didn't want to pay to keep people. His thought process was, it costs money to keep people, it's cheaper to have the lowest level employees. But I also want you to think about people who are willing to take the pay he was offering. Were they the smartest, most reliable people to begin with? So, the hot mick spreads into the air at 0.4 of a part per million. Mick is toxic to humans. In the dead of night, because this happened at midnight, around 1, a massive plume containing 40 tons of mick drifted to the nearby densely populated city. The toxic exposure resulted in the tragic death of about 4,000 people. However, In the chaos of people realizing there was a toxic plume falling on them, they evacuated their homes, which led to a human crush event, which in turn killed 12,000 people. So after this event in the US, one of the conservative judges said, ethics is knowing the difference between what you have the right to do and what is right to do. This quote serves as a powerful closing thought. So in this case, a factory, had it just been built and maintained and held to the same standards that we have in the US, wouldn't have been a problem. However, Union Carbide, wanting to bypass all of the regulations, didn't enforce any of them. This has caused countries like India and China to refuse investments from the US and do business with the US in certain aspects. And this is deservedly so. If you were living or had lived in that area and you had to deal with that, Union Carbide's reaction was, that's not our fault, that's not our problem. And honestly, had they just acknowledged their involvement in the factory they owned and managed, a lot of the Indian regulations around it wouldn't have been nearly as severe.